Welcome to tonight's Tertulia. My name is Matthew Hayes. On behalf of the other organizers, Tracy Glynn, Daniel Tubb, Christy Lane, and Megan Hill, I want to thank you for being here tonight. Our organizers and tonight's speaker are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey. In thinking about how this territory has been occupied over the last 250 years, I would invite you also to reflect on the unequal outcomes of that, how that has affected especially Indigenous people in different ways, and how different groups have used that space in ways that have led to important inequalities in our society. Our speaker, Basil Alexander, is assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at UNB. Basil will tell us a little more about his background with Ipperwash. I will just say that he's taught on Indigenous peoples in the law at Osgoode Hall Law School, as well as touching on those topics here at UNB. We would like to take an opportunity to thank our sponsors for tonight's event. So certainly the MB Media Co-op, who will be publishing the Tertulia later, have been a really important support for the Tertulias and making sure that people know about the Tertulias and have helped this to become a kind of regular Wednesday night institution of sorts. Also, we'd like to thank Fernwood, Verso, Between the Lines, and the Canadian Scholar Women's Press for their sponsorship as well. So just so that everyone knows, tonight's Tertulia is being recorded. We're going to record also the Q&A portion of tonight's discussion. If anyone doesn't want to be recorded, no problem. You can use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to put your question in there, and we can voice it for you. Just let us know. So without further ado, Basil, I will turn it over to you.
So thanks, Matthew. Good evening, everyone. Good to see everyone. And in fact, I see Alexis George is on the line as well, who I know from way back in the day. So if I do anything wrong tonight, she will be the first to report back to the family and basically call me out on that. So what we will do is I'm going to share my screen just to go over some things briefly, because what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be talking about Ipperwash and the looking back after 25 years, what are the things and where are we at and how have things changed over time? So what we're going to look at is basically look at Ipperwash in terms of where it comes from, the insights and lessons that come from it, and what are the things that I look at this from my perspective, having lived this for 3 years of my life from the inquiry side of things. So in terms of the general overview, I'm going to start by giving sort of the general and a personal background as to where do I fit in. And then that's going to lead into the following 3 things that will sort of be intertwined as we go throughout, although it'll go through this, through the various steps that we go through it. So what are the focuses and narrative that come out? This is a big story that involves looking at things from different perspectives, different issues, and different narratives that come out of that. And how does that influence and impact things with respect to everything? And then part of that is going to be examining and unpacking the story. Because it's very easy to look at a particular tree, and then you start to look at the forest, then you start to look at the county, and then you start to look at the country. And we're going to kind of look at that from that perspective, starting from September 6th and working our way back in terms of the evidence and the materials that come from that, and use the inquiry to inform that looking, because the inquiry actually did a lot to look at September 6th and what happened up until the point of the report, but then what happened afterwards. And from that, what can we take away and learn from that going forward? So in terms of what this story is really about, what I intend to do is talk about Dudley George. This is really about Dudley George, his death, and what happened as a result of everything that came from that. What were the events leading up to his death on the night of September 6th, and what happened after that with everything that fits in. I'm not going to pretend to be an Indigenous. I'm obviously not an Indigenous person. I'm not going to pretend to be an activist who is on the ground there. That's not the perspective I bring to this. The perspective I bring was I was a member of the team at the Public Inquiry for 3 years that basically represented the estate of Dudley George and his brother Sam George. So that's my involvement and that's my focus. So while I was not on the ground, the main thing that I did as a result was I spent a lot of time living and dealing with Ipperwash. Those from the area went through it from the historical things that they've been through, as well as the events that they went through that night, which were horrendous and tremendous in terms of the impact of that, and the stresses and the PTSD and everything that's flowed and come from that since then. I come at it from the detached, more of the lawyer perspective, and the one who tried to help where they could and represented people at the inquiry to make that work. And that's the perspective I bring to this. So that leads to the question of the narratives in terms of understanding where this is. And in order to understand that, you have to have a pretty good sense of where this starts with. And this is a map of Ontario, for those of you who don't know, and that red dot is Forest, Ontario. And Ipperwash is right around here. So everything is in this particular area of Ontario. That's the context that we're looking at. You also have to look at it from the context of the period, which is 1995. So when you look at that, you think about everything that we have today. Cell phones with technology, ongoing, everything like Facebook, everything else that's out there, computers that we have on laptops that we're able to do everything easily online, well, relatively easily. That wasn't the world in 1995. We had maybe the beginnings of cell phones and the wide consumer things that were going on. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People had not yet reported. It was in the progress of doing its work. It reported only in 1996, about 1996. This was obviously before the murdered and missing Indigenous women's and girls things that were going on, although all of this was going on over this period. This was a period where it's 1995. The charter had only been come into force in 1982. The first Supreme Court of Canada case happened in 1985. So you've got all of this coming on in terms of the period. So it's relatively young in terms of all of that context of what's going on in the law and everything else that's happening. And what you end up also having is the Oka crisis that happened in 1990 that reinforced that was going on, and sort of that was one of the major periods of the time in terms of informing Indigenous people's issues and interactions of land and what was happening with it, as well as what was happening right around this period in June and August 1995 to September 1995 were the things that was happening out in Gustafson Lake in British Columbia. So you've got all of this context that's going on. You've also got a progressive conservative government led by Mike Harris, who's been elected to power in Ontario under the Common Sense Revolution. So you've got all of this that's going on at this particular time. And what ends up happening is when you go back to Dudley ends up being, on the night of September 6th, the first Indigenous person in over 100 years killed over a historic Indigenous land claim. And it's these kind of things that it's like, how did this all come about? What are the narratives? What are the issues and the things that you need to think about? And why is narrative important? This is important because when you look at all this, that's the context of where the country and people were thinking about, which is very different than where we are now. And the narrative and the issues are important because you have to look at what was the original narrative that was put out that morning. This was the press release that the Ontario Provincial Police released before the Special Investigations Unit took over the investigation and basically would have muzzled the police from being able to issue anything that was going on. And it's a false narrative. A private citizen's vehicle was damaged by a number of First Nations people armed with baseball bats. As a result of this, the OPP crowd management team was deployed to disperse the crowd of First Nations people which had gathered at that location. As the crowd management unit was leaving the area, a school bus and full-size vehicle drove through the provincial park, striking a dumpster and pushing the dumpster and the vehicles into the crowd management team. Occupants of those two vehicles fired upon police, and subsequently police officers returned fire. This is the thing that came out on the morning of and became the media statement and the story as to what actually happened with respect to that. What had happened before and what were the things that were going on. This was the first thing that came out, and it stuck. Everything that's bolded, though, is a mischaracterization or flat out wrong. Private citizen's vehicle, it was actually somebody who was in the area. Armed with baseball bats, There was no baseball bats. There was a rock that was thrown. The crowd management team was deployed to disperse the crowd. It was 2 or 3 people when this happened. There was no crowd. As the report sort of went through and digested and figured out, it was only 2 or 3 people at the point that what happened. The crowd happened later on as a result of the Indigenous people in the park and the police feeding off each other in terms of information that was going back and forth. They were leaving the area, the crowd management unit. They were not leaving the area at the time. They had actually done what was known as a surge at that point, taken over a protester who had come out to try to talk to people and were restraining them and beating them at the time. And the issue of the vehicle coming out was from the Indigenous people who were driving that vehicle. They were trying to help with that in terms of the things that were going on. Pushing a dumpster and vehicle into the team, that gives the sense of that they were actually trying to do this to actually injure the crowd management team or the riot police. That isn't what happened. They were driving slowly and they were basically trying to get at the person to make it work. The biggest one, which is the biggest characterization, the occupants of those two vehicles fired upon police and the officers returned fire. The inquiry reinforced that the protesters were unarmed. And that was one of the major things that kind of needed to be understood in all of these things in order to make it work. It's a very different story if you're dealing with police interacting with unarmed protesters versus if you are returning fire in terms of the issues. And that's kind of the big thing. So this narrative, and this is the importance of the narrative, it changes and it reflects how setting it can have that. And this narrative stuck, arguably. Like there were people who disagreed with it or people who did research or they talked to people and they said, this doesn't make sense. Otherwise the litigation wouldn't have happened. And people began talking to people and asking questions. But it was only when the person who killed Dudley George, Ken Dean, was convicted of killing him, that the narrative finally changed because the judge basically found Ken Dean's testimony that Dudley was carrying a rifle and aiming it at people not credible. And that was the point where it sort of realized, where it became broader in terms of understanding where people are and the things that you need to figure out from it. So these are the things that need to be considered when one is thinking about narrative, and what are the issues and the factors that sort of apply for it. What you've got is you've got different things that are at play. You've got the Indigenous people on the ground, right? You've got historic land claims that are going on in terms of trying to interact. You've got two communities at the time who have had differences due to historical things, and that's a long story that's there in terms of all of the things. But you've got people who basically are trying to reclaim historic lands from them. You've got policing issues. Is it the issues of the police that are at play in terms of the police talking to and trying to, and how they should be interacting with protesters or the others, people who they don't understand or they have different views? What are the actions, and what are they being racist, or are they raising things up? Are they doing things that are inappropriate? Are they policing appropriate, or are they making things worse? And what are their actions that are contributing factors of that? You've got issues of government accountability. One of the reasons why this issue arguably kept going and had such an interest and impact over the long period of time is, what was the role of Queen's Park? What was the role of the Harris government in all of this happening and things working out over time? What did they do? Did they have anything to do with this? And part of that is their own actions fed into that. They went into a very defensive mode. They were not open, and they basically tried to prevent anything from going out and took a very litigious role throughout the litigation and throughout all of this as this was playing out when things were happening. You've got the media issue about how this issue was covered and what are the perceptions and the systemic things that are at play. And what you've really got at the end of it all is back to same, right? Where what you've got is the idea of a brother who wants to know what happened to his brother. Why was his brother killed? What actually happened? And I think that's actually the reason why this actually happened a lot of, and I don't mean to take away from what everybody else went through. I think Sam ended up being the bridge that could end up being communicating with the issues that were happening on the ground and what could happen, and be a step back from the community, although he was part of the community, and do those interactions to kind of get people to understand. And what people found is, because of the way Sam interacted with everyone, it was this idea of understanding, if this is his brother and he was killed, something's not right here. He was never angry when he dealt with the media. He was always forthright. He always asked that simple question, I just want to know what happened. And it was that quest of finding answers in that context of it that understood it. And then there's the final one, which I'd argue is the bigger one in order to understand that, the historic land issues that one needs to deal with and understand that actually underlines all of this. And that's the issue that I think is the big picture thing that comes back to, it affects people here in New Brunswick and it affects people across the country, because guess what? That's the reason that all of this sort of fits in and is the big thing when you look at the country with everything from the bigger picture. So as a result of that, when you've got through all of this, at the end of this process, this happened in 1995, Sam went through many years with my principal at the time, or the principal who I ended up working with, Murray Klippenstein, trying to find those answers. And part of that was litigation. And the government took the perspective that they would not call an inquiry or not do anything while that litigation was pending. When the Conservatives were when the Liberals were elected in 2003, 2004, one of their campaign promises was to start the inquiry. And as a result of that, through some things that had happened, they called the inquiry. And you can see why, right? Like, it's one of the standard things of public inquiries is you want to go after the people who you have issues with or were just going out of power in order to figure out things. But there are obvious systemic issues here. I have to give a lot of credit to Jerry Phillips and other people in the party. They were the ones who really understood and took this on, not from a purely political stance. Like, I'm not going to lie and say that politics didn't play a role, but he was deeply and personally interested and could sense that something was wrong in trying to figure this out. That inquiry happened started in 2004, went on for 3 years, and the report came out in 2007 in terms of everything that came out. And it's 4 volumes. You can't see it, but I have it sitting here on the side as I thump it. It's over 1,000 to 1,500 pages. I'm probably one of a handful of people who've actually read all of it. And it's one of those things that I sat there for 3 years to understand it. But you have to understand the context of how that actually played out in terms of the things that need to come of it. This is where the hearings were held. You'll remember when we go back that all of this occurred over here in right around here. And I'll show you this on a map in due course, but Forest is very far from Toronto. And one of the issues that was a key thing that needed to be figured out is how and where were we going to do hearings? And the inquiry did the vast majority of its hearings here in Forest, Ontario. And where that plays out is it was actually held in this building right here. This was Kimball Hall in Forest, and it looks like a pretty big building until you realize that it's a community center for a small town, and this thing in the back is an ice rink and an arena. The actual hearing room is this area right here in the front. This is where we spent 3 years doing this hearing in terms of the materials and the things that sort of that we spent at, where almost everybody testified. This is a picture of what the inquiry room looked like as for half of it. So what you've got here at the top is Commissioner Linden, some of the stuff for the standard for inquiries in terms of the things that are bad. This is where the witness would sit, right? So this is Gwen Boniface, who was the OPP commissioner in 2006. And then the lawyers, whenever they're cross-examining or asked or examining, they'd be standing here at the podium. And then you've got rows of tables where counsel would sit, and they would have people who would be going here. And the way it worked out is Sam would sit always to the right beside the podium. Then whoever was main counsel would be sitting here. In this case, it's Murray. And then if I was junioring, I'd be sitting on the other side. What you've got directly behind is the OPP. This is OPP counsel who are sitting behind, Mark Sandler and Andrea. And then off to the side here, right off to the right, would be the counsel for Mike Harris. There'd be a third row, which was some of the counsel for Deb Hutton. And then there'd be a fourth row behind that. And then this is only half the room. The other half of the room is the other side. So this was what we had to do logistically in order to make the inquiry work in a small area and understand them. This is a picture of how it looks from the other side of things. Andrea Tuck-Jackson is here. She's the other OPP officer. This is counsel for the government of Ontario. Not Mike Harris. All the politicals had their own people, so that increases the number of people. And this is where we would be sitting right beside the podium in terms of working things out. Media is a key thing to understand this as well. When Mike Harris was testifying as the highest profile political person who was on the stand, the room was filled. And you can actually see here, they had a little back room here where they would set up and the media would basically be packed in depending on how things would work. It's not like you're at a conference center or anything like that. It's just basically you make it work. And you can actually see, this is the room that overlooks the arena. So you can see the hockey banners in the background in terms of the things that are here. And what they would do is they would set up their satellite trucks in the parking lot so that way they could broadcast their stories. However, if you remember, this is forest. This is not close to Toronto. This is not close to Hamilton. This is not close to any of those things. So what this is they would only be there for certain days and certain periods. They wouldn't follow in due course. Sometimes the print media or the local print media would be there, but part of the issue is how do you get the story out or how do you tell the story rather than people just dropping in for bigger things? One of the ways we did that, given the distance between Forest and Toronto, which was about 2.5, which was about about 3 hours driving, is a webcast. We were involved in terms of, this is one of the earliest times in terms of broadcast. Supreme Court of Canada and other inquiries didn't start it. We actually were involved in starting this for the first time. The inquiry ended up taking it over. Supreme Court of Canada actually started webcasting their court hearings shortly after using the same technology, and inquiries ever since have kind of dealt with it since then. What the inquiry did was it offered a certain degree of accountability to understand what was going on. And so it took all of those narratives and issues and factors that we're looking at, and I have to give them credit, they explored them in detail and went through it in great detail and tried to understand what was happening from both the individual fact finding, what actually happened on the day of, and what were the policy perspectives and policy analysis and issues that we needed to deal with. So start with, one of the biggest factors here are the police. Obviously, Indigenous people were there. They provided their testimony from what they saw happen and the perspective of what happened. These are arguably two of the more important ones that were there. John Carson was the police officer who was in charge of the policing actions and what the police would actually do. He testified. He was one of the people who testified the longest at the inquiry, because he was involved in what was set up, what were the government, what was the police planning, why they were thinking, and all of that. And then you also have the commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police at the time who testified about what had changed and what were the things that were going on. As a result of those inquiries, you find out some of the systemic things that were going on and some of the things that were happening. Part of that is that there was some racist paraphernalia that was going on in terms of the material and things that police officers were creating in terms of mementos and things like that. There would be some comments that were made about that in terms of luring people into pits with watermelons like they do down south. They would create commemorative, they'd create mugs. So this is a mug with an OPP logo and an arrow through it in order to remember Team Ipperwash. They created this idea of a t-shirt that had this logo with the, again to remember it, from the ERTs, the emergency response team, or the riot police. TRU are snipers. And then what they did is they put a feather on its side, which is a problem in terms of the other things. One of the ones that came out during the inquiry was this other t-shirt, which Project Maple was the name of the operation, and they used the TRU logo, the Tactical Response Team logo, breaking an arrow with the Emergency Response Team as an anvil. So these are things that were not exactly the greatest things that came across, and were sort of indicative of the systemic things. And arguably, all of this is indicative of the systemic contributors to the police actions and the escalation and the approach and how people talked about and thought about what was going on the ground, as well as Indigenous peoples. The flip side of that is we've got the Indigenous perspective, we've got the police perspective, what's the government perspective? So what you've also got is the accountability of government, both civil servants and the highest political people. Larry Taman was the Deputy Attorney General. So he testified at length about this. And his notes are, one of his notes actually says, starts to indicate the issues of the fact that the Premier would want them out. Deb Hutton was the executive assistant to the Premier, who was known for basically speaking on behalf of the Premier and would have that certain voice. And there are actually meetings in terms of, you can actually see as we go through the meetings, how the tone of the meetings change in terms of what the civil service are trying to do, but then once they hear from the political people as to what are the issues, what are the things that they need to deal with. Throughout all of this, they aren't talking about the historic issues. It's very much about right now and the things that are going on. You also get to hear what were the actual views of Mike Harris, not directly. There was never going to be a situation where Mike Harris ordered the OPP to go into Ipperwash and do that. But it was pretty clear what he actually wanted to do or what he wanted to happen.
As I walked into the dining room, the Premier in a loud voice said, "I want the fucking Indians out of the park."
Charles Harnack was the Attorney General at the time. So these are the things that are at play in terms of the perspective and what people wanted. And this testimony was found credible by the commissioner. While the Premier Mike Harris said he didn't say this, or this was not something that was happened, it was clear this was the intention that they wanted and what they wanted to happen in terms of the things that were going on. And this is reflecting to the comments that was happening on the day of September 6th. So you can see the pressure that was going up and the things that were happening. What ends up happening though, in terms of the next thing, is even though there was never the direct order, OPP take them out, the Harris's intent as to what he wants to have happen ends up getting leaked and ends up going through and being told to the police commander on the ground. There was a police officer who was a liaison in that meeting, and this is an excerpt from the recording between the person who was Ron Fox on the picture, as well as his communication with John Carson on the ground then.
The Premier is quite adamant that this is not an issue of Native rights, and in his words, I mean, we've tried to pacify and pander to these people for too long. It's now time for swift affirmative action.
Just give me a sec here. So these are examples of what was going on at the point. And the inquiry did a very good job of pulling all of this stuff out and being able to talk about it and hold people accountable in terms of bringing people up and finding the reports and discussing it. And what are the issues and problems with this? Because this gets communicated among other people kind of understand what's going on. And it was never a direct pressure or direct, but the problem of this leaking sort of shows the different issues and the different problems that are happening at different levels of government and the systemic problems that need to be dealt with. What this all sort of leads to is, this is all great, and it's very easy to focus on the individuals, right? That this is a problem of Premier Harris, this is a problem of some of the people on the ground, and I admit that, you know, part of what I did was I found out that there are certain people on the ground who were dealing with this or bringing things forward. But in order to understand this systemically, one needs to take the bigger picture back in order to understand this. Because it's one thing to talk about policing and what was happening on the day of and the incidents and the decisions and how those decisions were made and what were the factors in terms of the immediate inputs. But what this really comes back to is looking back at historical land loss and what were the impacts and things that flow from that and the things that need to be considered and how that impacts and actually creates the foundation for all of these things that pass through and are continued today and are still some of the things. This is something I do in all of my classes. I take you to a couple links regarding to show you kind of this. If you're not familiar, I wouldn't be surprised if you are. It's a couple maps here to just sort of get a sense of what's going on. So this is nativeland.ca, and this is a map of Canada in the sense of, you get a sense of what are the various territories, traditional territories of the people that are around here. You can see overlapping, it's all across the country, it's everything that's there. And if we sort of zoom in here, This is the area where we're talking about Ipperwash and the people who now live in Kettle Point and Stony Point, right? We're talking about this area right here. You can see it's all covered in terms of that. Part of this is the treaties that sort of come in. So as you can see, there's treaties that covers over much of Canada. And these often involve secession of land. This treaty in 1827, the Huron Tract Treaty, is the one that actually results in the loss of land for Indigenous people. And what this issue is as of the 1800s, most of the treaties that Canada entered into were about secession of land. For those of you who are from here in New Brunswick, our treaties were peace and friendship treaties. They were not involved in the actual secession of land. They were just about actually dealing with peace and friendship. Whereas a lot of the other stuff was giving up land in exchange for other things and other contexts that were going on. You can see the amount of land in terms of the tracts that were going on. You would think, what were they giving up or what was the bargain? This is a map of all the First Nations across country, all these green dots. You'd think that looks like a lot in terms of the amount of land, except that's not actually their land. The purple highlighted is what's involved in order to understand what it is. You can see lots of purple on that map, can't you? And I'm being sarcastic. There is purple on this map. And if we end up zooming in, you begin to see how much purple there actually is. Kettle and Stony Point, Kettle Point is here, Stony Point would be about here. All the rest is all that's left. Basically, as a result of this treaty, the First Nations people lost 99% of their land and kept less than 1%. So this is the systemic issue, and this is the thing that's here. And the way I explain it to everybody else is always, forget everything about the law, forget about everything else, forget about everything else, anything else that we talk about. This is always about the fact that they were here first, and we used Western society and colonial society in order to dispossess people of land and do other things as a result. Things that result in Indian residential schools, cultural issues, cultural destruction, and there's a reason why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chose to use the term genocide with respect to this. And these are all the things that need to be considered when you're thinking about this. So that's the context in terms of these are the things that are going on. That's the big thing when you're looking at the country. But then you look at what actually happened with Kettle and Stony Point. So I'm going to show you some maps here. So I showed you what it looked like on the other one. This is Kettle Point right here. And this is what was Stony Point at the time. So this is what they were actually left with in terms of thinking things through or what they would have at the end of it all. What ended up happening over time was land being surrendered or expropriated. Initially, there was some stuff along the beachfront that was surrendered in order to make this work. I have a friend, Monica Virtue, who's been doing a fair bit of research into all of the stuff that kind of comes up here. And she's done a lot of good things to understand that this was a situation where the Indian agent would end up arranging meetings in order to surrender arguably some of the best land, some of the best beachfront land that was in Ontario in terms of things that needed to go on. Those of you who are familiar with Ontario or know about lakes, Lake Huron is one of the best lakes to actually have something on. And what ended up happening was the idea was to surrender to this so that the mainstream society could have places that they could develop for beachfront property and beachfront cottages. And that's what you actually have now here in this character. So it was a one-time thing. The legitimacy of it is a big issue in terms of the things that are at play. And they also surrendered this at that time. That left this little bit for Stony Point. And you can see if you look at these dates, these happened in 1920s, 1920s, those surrenders. This one is the more interesting one. Don't get me wrong, the other ones are interesting too. But what ended up happening was 1942, World War II is going on. And what the Department of National Defense decides to do is expropriate one entire reserve. So this is one First Nation who's sharing who's sharing the land. They've all got this one, and they decide to expropriate this reserve and literally move everybody from here to here and convert this to a training camp for the military and for the defense. So what you've done is you've already reduced from 100% down to less than 1% of the land. You've now taken this little 1% and you literally physically forcibly moved everybody from this point over to here. This is the historic context in terms of the things that are at play. And this is actually a picture of one of the houses literally being tracted from one point to the other point, and literally being a whole bunch of people being moved in terms of the things that were going on and that needed to be done. Part of this issue and part of the things that need to be considered is when this expropriation occurred, it was supposed to be returned after the war. So the government made the recommendation or the promise that they would return it after the war in order to, when it was done. Problem is that never happened. Instead, it became a permanent army camp, which was located in this area here, and they did training for over 50 years. It was only in 1993 that Dudley George and other people, after trying, and they've tried various ways to try to get it back, and the federal government wouldn't do anything about it. They ended up buying this little part of the land up front at some point and adding it to the park. There was no interest in returning it or any of that kind of stuff. It didn't end up happening. In 1993, Dudley George and a couple others ended up entering and sort of occupying and living there. 1995, in July 1995, the Department of Defense ended up leaving. And then this entire part was essentially occupied by First Nations people, even though it was technically still part of the Department of Defense. This part up here was Ipperwash, and is Ipperwash Provincial Park, and this is what became a provincial park run by the Ontario government. Now here's where this gets interesting. So this is the only part that's left. This is what the land was all about. This is what the things on September 6th was all about. This is what everybody was talking about. This small little bit of land, which is something that historically had issues and was part of this whole other broader issue. What gets more interesting when you sort of play this out is how did the incident actually occur? The incident occurred right up here in this little corner of the park. And this is a Google map blow up of how it looks today. It literally occurred in about this spot right here. And you don't have perspective at this point in terms of understanding how big that is. I can tell you one of the things that always struck me about this issue when I went down to the park and had a look is the fact of how small all of this space is in terms of understanding it and the context of what's going on. So this is actually very small. And this is kind of another perspective on it, 3 different pictures of it. You've got kind of the pictures of the road signs, right? This is probably no bigger than the classroom I'm in right now. Probably no bigger than about 10 to 20 meters in terms of where all of these incidents happened. So this is where the confrontation happened that night. This is where all of the things kind of happened. And this is kind of the funny thing about all this is as much as we see the comment that, that these people were armed and they fired on police, and even though this is all over a very small amount of land, you have to understand how the police came down. They literally came marching down this road here, banging their shields to make noise as an intimidation tactic. What would normally happen is if you were dealing with something that was a riot that was caused by a soccer game or a hockey game, people would disperse. That's not what happened because these are people who are fighting for their historic homelands. And if they actually thought that they were armed, you would never come marching down this street in perfect formation with people who are hunters and can easily take you out one by one. It would just be something that makes no sense in this small neighborhood space in terms of everything that goes on. So this is kind of the thing that always, when anybody who goes there and gets a sense of it, you kind of get a sense of how small this area is for all of this stuff and how small the land is that we're talking about in order to deal with. So that's the context. And that's what has been dealing with all of these things in terms of understanding it, or what are the things that need to be dealt with and understood. And this is where we sort of get into the issues of what we actually think, what has actually been helpful or what has been useful over the longer term. Because that's what happened up until that point. This is what happened in 2007. What happened since then, and these are the things that we can start to learn, is number one, the value of the accountability that one can get when you're doing this. When you have a good report and you have people who listen and people who are willing to go through it, and look at the broader systemic issues rather than just the individuals, or take the individuals and understand how that's broader than systemic, you can make things better. And part of what Justice Linden did in his report was cover off a lot of things in terms of talking about policing issues, talking about how to make government better, and what are the issues that we need to be considering. Granted, we've done a lot more things. We did a lot more cases with the Supreme Court of Canada. We had a lot more reports at that point in order to help with that. But this was another brick in terms of understanding that and making that work. One of the most important things that came out of that is, how do you understand policing Indigenous people who are protesting systemic historic issues? What are the things you need to do? Because arguably the police are often caught between a rock and a hard place, but you don't want to exacerbate that by being a systemic, by trying to treat people as others, and that you're only going to assert mainstream, which is what's happened in the past. It's understanding that part of what your role is there is probably to keep the peace, not necessarily to enforce the law, and then figuring out things over the longer picture, because what is part of law is something that is a very open question that needs to be thought about and understood. It did play out, arguably, immediately while this was going on. While the Ipperwash Inquiry was going on, the first set of protests about Caledonia occurred. And as a result of the thinking that was going on, or some of the stuff that was going on, and people being aware of this, what ended up happening was the government came up with a creative solution of buying the land at issue and then finding a way to deal with that. And they found a way to diffuse it. Now it's come up again, but this is the kind of point of why this keeps coming up and the issues that need to be considered from it. And this is not going to be going away, because this is kind of the things that are going to be going forward. We see this in Burnt Church. We see this in the issues that are happening now locally with respect to lobster fishing and everything else that's happening now in Atlantic Canada. It's happening elsewhere as well in terms of use of land and what are people going to be using, and the implications that are going on. There's also one of the things that this is probably one of those situations where the cover up and lying is worse than the actual event. So ironically, if people had been more upfront or more willing to admit mistakes and talk about it, it probably would have diffused solutions a lot faster than the comments and the approach people did when they actually talked about it. Because they became very defensive, very much about hiding things, and very much about running people through the ground, so that way they wouldn't have the power or the pressure to continue fighting. And what ended up happening was people kept going. And then by the time everything came up, it made the story worse than what had actually happened. If people had actually taken those things, it would have been better. It also talks about the influence of what people in power, when they understand these things and they're willing to take change or they're willing to help, how that can do it. You can contrast the actions of the Mike Harris government and what they did in 1995. And granted, there was a great de-escalation after Dudley's death at that point. But what was with the McGuinty government who came in after, they took a very different approach in terms of understanding it and trying to deal with it. And arguably part of this was understanding the education. They tried to take a very different thing in terms of implementing many of the recommendations and trying to put that in. Now, part of the reality is government changes, and it's how does that change? But we've seen that kind of thing changing over time. We see that happening now at the federal government level, and we see that happening in provincial governments in terms of the issues we have to deal with. It also reinforces how we actually make systemic change and how we can move forward. The idea of the fact that systemic change is something that takes time, is something that's got to be worked on, and not something that's easy and that will be done quickly. It's these points that need to be considered, because this is something that is still going on 20 to 25 years after the fact. And to illustrate this, I'm going to go back to showing the map of the surrenders that were at play. What's ended up happening was in 2008, at late 2007, this is the park, what was going on. And this also reinforces the point of how influencing people and using things in order to influencing people and being to make that change. The provincial government promised in 2007 to return the land. And part of the reason why they made that promise, and that and one of the reasons why Sam asked for that and suggested that, is a full transfer is not an easy thing to do to make it back into reserve land. It involves transfers to the federal government. It involves a whole bunch of land transactions. It takes years to do it. It was only in 2017 that this land that they promised to give back in 2007 was actually transferred to the federal government. And it was only in 2020 that it was formally converted back to reserve status. Similarly, that's the other thing that is applied in terms of all of this land. And in between 2007 and 2017, they did incremental change and tried to do influences to move things forward by working through co-management and sort of moving towards it step by step and understanding. What ended up happening over the long term and more recently is the Army camp is in the process of being returned to, I believe it was just returned actually, to the First Nation. So from 1942 to 2021, 2020, that's the period it took for the land to actually get returned back to the First Nation in terms of understanding that. And part of that is the nature of the fact this has been used as an army base. There was unexploded ammunition all over the place that all needed to be cleaned up. It was not simple. And the conversion to reserve status takes time and is all of the things that come on. So it underscores the important nature of the systemic change. And the way we think about things today is arguably very different than how we thought about things in 1995, how we thought about things in 2007, and will be very different in a few years as to how we think about things now. And then the final thing is the importance of narrative and resilience to keep going through this. You saw what the story was at the beginning of all of this in terms of the story that the OPP put out and how that story changed over time in terms of understanding what are the things that came out and the issues that needed to be influenced and all the factors and influences that need to be considered and thought about in order to make that work. It took a long time for that narrative to change. And there's a lot of other things that have changed in terms of the narrative and the way we look at systemic issues. But that's the importance of how to do this. And this is all arguably played out into my own research, where now I look at how do you actually look at accomplishing systemic change over the long term with narrative, and what's the role of demonstration from the law when you're trying to make things work. So that's kind of the big picture things. And these issues are not going to go away. These are issues that we're going to need going forward. These are issues that are something that we're going to need to work on going forward, not just in Indigenous context, because I think a lot of the lessons we have here regarding how you deal with protests or things that I saw reappearing in the Toronto G20 that happened in 2010. We're going to see them as other things happen as we go through. What are the ways that we can do to try to actually move forward and actually deal with things in a practical way and actually try to deal with these systemic issues rather than just using law as a hammer in order to make things not go well. So that's kind of the summary. And there's lots of other stuff that we could talk about. I'm happy to answer questions. I know way too much about this topic. And I'm happy to go where people want to go.
Thank you, Basil. So that was a very interesting talk. I learned a lot. So if folks want to ask their question in the chat room, or you could also use the raised hand function. Oh, Karen has a question. So Karen, you can go ahead.
Hey, Basil, that was really interesting. I have to say, I was been thinking about you and your work over the past few days or week when I've been reading about what's happening in England with the repression of protest and the bill that was almost passed that people, I haven't read the bill in any detail, but that would outlaw most protest if you annoyed someone, I believe was what people were saying about it. So I'm not going to ask you about that directly, but I started thinking about it when I was reading some of the coverage about that, about the difference between what seemed to be an issue there was the difference between a vigil and a protest. Right. And in the context of what you were just talking about, I was thinking, what's the difference then between a protest and a land occupation? And what's the difference between a protest and, what the Mi'kmaq lobster fishers were doing? So I don't actually know where the legal boundaries are there. So it would be really interesting to hear your take on that.
Well, part of the problem is law kind of sucks for protests. That's kind of one of my pieces that I've written, is kind of the reality of the nature of injunction law, the nature of the criminal law and the way it works, the nature of everything else, a lot of different contexts. Trespass law, for example, they tend to like rights that are concrete, that you can understand. This is somebody's land. This is land that the law recognizes, and it tends to privilege those over things that are more diffuse and that we don't understand how to deal with. So part of the problem is, A, how do you recognize actual conflicts that might be systemic or historic when somebody actually has a right? B, how do you actually deal with using protests as peaceful protests, to be clear, as a relieving mechanism in order to deal with that? I think law insists. We can talk about the reality of protests and violence and how that fits in, but from a legal perspective, I don't think the law can deal with violence. I don't think it can condone that. It can deal with inconvenience. It can deal with people being not nice, but I think violence is the issue where law is going to have. But then how do you actually deal with the interaction with other people's rights, quote unquote, that the law recognizes? That's something that's going to require a lot more thinking and trying to understand. And a lot of this, I think, is what's the role of police in this? So part of the issues that happened with respect to the CN rail protests that happened is the injunctions in order to protect CN's rights to go through that. But part of the point here was to be inconvenient and raise points and raise the attention to the issues. So it's this issue of how much of this is, okay, what's the law's role? Because law is a very blunt object in those situations, but how we strategically use it and being a little bit more alive to the fact of how laws are being used into this and what is the role of the police. And I frankly think police should be taking much more of a keep the peace kind of perspective and then figure out what you deal with in terms of the legal side in other contexts and deal with that outside of that. Whereas if you're dealing with something on the ground, your goal is to keep the peace and then sort of see where things go from there.
So very different from the policing practice at protests currently.
Well, and that's part of the issue, right? Like Toronto G20 was very much about surveillance and actually engaging, and that ended up being arguably a complete wipeout of just getting everybody and throwing them in the detention center for 3 days. Lo and behold, very few people got out until, oh wait, the conference is over, now everybody's out. And then that ended up, and that's another example of how this takes time, right? So those events happened in June 2010. It was only this last year that the class action settled. So that's kind of the period in terms of like these things take a long time to work their way through.
Hey, thanks.
A couple questions now. So Ian Attridge is asking what activities rebuilt trust to enable a transfer back. And I don't know if Ian wants to say anything more, but you can turn on your mic if you do. So that's the question, Basil, is that what activities rebuilt trust to enable a transfer back?
I'm going to have to leave the talk shortly to host another Allies event, but appreciate the talk and any quick thoughts on building trust and building that capacity for land return in a practical sense.
I think it actually starts by doing things small. So I think you start with small things. So you try to find things that people actually agree on and that you can understand and that are more, don't try to deal with everything at once. Just try to deal with something small that there's agreement that you can actually get things going, because then you actually start to interact with people and you can actually get things understanding and see where things go. One of the major issues I have generally, this is just me personally, has with the land treaty process is it does the opposite. We have to solve everything when we're resolving a treaty in order for the governments to do everything, right? And it's our nature. I'm a lawyer. Don't agree to everything until it's all done. But if you can actually sometimes say, you know what, in principle, here's where we agree. We're going to take some time to figure this out. And what are the little things that we can do to make things work? That's a good way to do that. So can you make arrangements where, like in the Ipperwash situation, they went through co-management of the park for a period of time. And then that developed the communication and getting to know and understand people. I defer to those who are on the ground and dealing with it, because that's not something I dealt with a lot. I dealt with it much more further back. And then can you make certain things that are incremental and try to do everything? And rather than trying to do everything at once, can you add the little bits over time that it suddenly becomes something that's useful? You see this in logging or other natural resource contexts, right? No. Like, does it have to be everything? Or can you find a way or a solution that it actually works, at least for one particular thing, and not try to solve everything at once? And then build on that bit by bit by bit by bit. There's other things that are out there. One of the things I teach in legal ethics is things about cultural competency. So the idea of being aware of your own culture and the understanding of what are steps that you can do to try to understand somebody who's from a different culture and lived experience than you, and what are the things that you have to be thinking about in order to understand that. And understanding the implications of trauma and not just dismissing things, and understanding how that can impact how people work, as well as the fact of complex societies. So how do you deal with things that all of these differences and diversity and variations, what are the things you need to be thinking about in order to make that work? It's a very short answer for a very complicated question.
Hey, Gretz, thank you. Thanks for your talk.
Thanks, Ian. So Matthew has a question, and it's, he says that I remember reporting about Ipperwash, which occurred during my first week at university, but I don't remember much about what happened after that until there was an inquiry. Can you say a bit more about how this went from cover up to the announcement that there would be an inquiry?
So I wasn't around then. So everything you're going to hear is a little bit more third hand. Alexis probably knows more than I do actually about the details of what was going on during that period. So what ended up happening was in 1995, one of the first things that ended up happening was after Sam dealt with immediate things of what was going on, he got in touch with a few lawyers in order to try to understand this. And through a series of connections, he ended up eventually with Murray Klippenstein. Murray Klippenstein and some of the other people he was working with ended up talking to a whole bunch of people in the area to try to figure out what was going on. And they realized that it was not the narrative or the things that were being said, and that other things just didn't make sense, and that things were kind of didn't make sense in all of this. They tried to get other ways in terms of how can we resolve this through other ways. They thought strategically, would an inquest do it? Well, actually it wouldn't, because it wouldn't deal with the systemic issues. It's a very narrow thing in terms of the mandate of it. It was clear that the Harris government was not something that they were interested in doing at this time for obvious reasons. In terms, and that became clear at the inquiry in terms of some of the stuff that came out in retrospect. And so what they did was they launched a lawsuit, and that lawsuit lasted from 1996 to 2003. And the course of that lawsuit was basically a whole bunch of litigation games that was going back and forth. It's civil procedure at its hardest and at its things. So it's all the litigation things that are at play in terms of you file a statement of claim, the other side says no, or that's not enough information, give me more information, I gotta do that. And you end up fighting before judges about things that we're going through. And they literally went through the entire process. And so for those who aren't familiar with how litigation works, it's not as simple as you just show up to court and do it. It's a process where it can take 3 to 5 years before you're before a judge. That's the nature of the period, right? For really complicated cases. And it's because you have all these intervening steps and steps that you got to do. Here's what I say was happened. Here's what the defense says what happens, but they can argue and say, you didn't give me enough info, so we're going to do that. You then get through, is this all appropriate? Is this legally right? Does this make all that sense? You have all of these fights. And an adversarial system that litigation is, you're doing this back and forth. And you're just basically trying to survive from step to step. I obviously was not involved in either side at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised if part of this was a war of attrition, trying to basically drive the other side in terms of the resources and try to make things up and to answer all the questions. You then get into what is known as discovery, where you would basically have to provide answers. And part of the nature of civil litigation is you can get, and this is actually a really big power of it if you're able to get this far. The other side is required to give all the documents that are relevant to your claim. But then what happens if you don't put them in the right form or you don't answer a question? You then you got to fight about that. And then what ends up happening is the process goes in terms of, okay, well now you get to orally examine them before you go to trial. And in regular litigation, the idea here is to simplify the issues you deal with at trial. Because if you have only this many issues, well, then it's actually less and it's supposed to lead to settlement. In complex litigation where the sides are truly adversarial, it's all about avoiding answers and it's all about not trying to make things work or deal with that. It's a different mindset in terms of the things that you're trying to do. So you fight and you get these people, but they're still under oath. They have to answer the questions. And then after that, you get to go to trial. And what ended up happening was the trial was set to begin right after the election. There was even there was even things going on about what date should the trial be? Should it be during the election? Should it be after? And it ended up being postponed until after. And then what ended up happening was, once it looked like that the Liberal government was going to take over, Ernie Eves had taken over for Mike Harris at that point, the litigation was, an offer to settle was accepted, not to admit anything, but to basically clear the decks, because the Liberal government had promised they were going to call an inquiry. And what governments tend to do is they tend to play this whole game of, well, there's litigation, so therefore we can't talk about it. And it was basically the idea of, let's just deal with let's just move on and trust them to call things in terms of where it goes. Then they issue the inquiry and everything else goes from there. And that's its own process. That took about 6 months to get everything ramped up. Hearings began in 2004 because then the inquiry itself has to get all these documents from everybody, sort them, and figure out what things are, digitize them and electronically, which in the 2000s is much different than how we did it today. And the actual hearings go from there. So.
Thank you. So there's a question from Sophie Lavoie, who's joining us on Facebook Live. So she asked, in terms of process, I'm wondering about the length of time for land appropriation for Camp Ipperwash and moving the community versus the return of the land once it was decided. Isn't there a huge imbalance there? Is the time requirement not rooted in the power imbalance between the actors involved?
Well, this is the thing. When they expropriated the land, they promised to return it after the war. They just never did. So that was kind of the big issue. The power imbalances, I think, are huge. I'm not going to argue that in terms of the things that were at play. There were, one of the things with Indigenous communities and every small community is they're small communities, right? So you've got those people and personal things that are going on in terms of it that happens in every small community when you're thinking about that. So that is exasperated when, like, it's not like you're living in downtown Toronto, right? Or you're not living in downtown Fredericton. It's a different kind of thing. So part of the thing of understanding is the period, they could have just taken the land. That arguably would have been easier and would have just been, okay, they were just mean, but they actually promised to take it back, to return it, and they didn't. So number one, they took the land. And what was really kind of interesting was they could have taken any of the other farmland in the area, and they chose the reserve. So this is kind of the thing of why was that decision made in the 1940s rather than anywhere else. I leave it to others to make the decisions. And then I think this is the reality of, with the power imbalance that's kind of been exacerbated over time, what litigation and what all of this process did is I think it gave back a little bit of that power. And then the question is, how do you actually continue that going forward? I'm not sure if I answered the power imbalance part completely correctly or if I addressed what they were getting at, but that's kind of my take on it off the top.
Okay, thank you, Basil. So I don't, there are no other questions in the chat room, but I want to give folks a moment if you want to raise your hand or ask the question in the chat room.
Go ahead, I don't see other hands.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you. I missed the beginning, unfortunately, but that was very informative. And what I want to ask about is not very coherently formed, but it just seems that there must be, can you hear me okay? I'm with headphones, yeah, okay. There must be something that can be done in to make, like, what can we learn from all of these things about how to make to have a better chance in this process? Like the government obviously has all the power, but, and then like, while you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so why can't there be a federal something saying that, the systemic racism has to be considered in injunctions about land or something? Like, and then I'm like, well, even like, no, is there any federal government that's going to want to do that? Do you think it's possible to make that happen in spite of the fact that they won't want to do it? Like, there's got to be something. I don't know, and I'm sorry that it's, you know, not very coherent, but I'll stop talking and see if you have anything to say about it.
Well, dealing with these issues is arguably not coherent. It's just difficult. It's bit by bit that you've got to deal with it as you're doing the best you can. Anything is possible, but the question is in what avenue and in what is the best way to do it, and what is the best way to devote time and resources to actually make things work. One of the things I used to do when I was in private practice as a public interest social justice lawyer, when I would talk to somebody, is let's say I get through the initial steps of, okay, you have a case. Just because you have a case, do you really want to bring a case? Or is it better for you to take the money or the resources and everything else and use that to do things through another way? And more often than not, people actually like that. They didn't like that answer, but they liked the idea that they could think about, okay, well, what is the best use of my time and the best way to actually do this to accomplish the goal that I wanted to do? So I think there's argument for change. I think part of my perspective is going to be talking, like, this is long-term projects for me, right? Like, this is spawn work that I'm doing in research in terms of what's the role of how police and how should the law deal with protests, and one of them is injunctions. So this whole idea of, well, you can make a declaration, but then make the police enforce it? Maybe not. What's the different perspectives? Part of it is it's always about people. So as much as we look at institutions and we think about this, so much of this is reflective of the people involved and what you actually need to do and think about. That part of it is just getting people to understand things a bit more, so that way, and be willing to understand it. So because it's one thing to understand it, it's another thing to be willing. It's one thing to expose them to it. They have to be willing to understand it and then figure out ways to make that work. And I think that's just a long-term working at process. It's one of the reasons I am now a teacher, right? Like, one of the reasons I enjoy being a prof is I get to work with a whole bunch of law students and hopefully help the next generation understand some of this a little bit better. And I'm hopefully what somebody will, that's kind of the things to work on and kind of do that. So I think it's a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach that one has to take. And then it's a question of, this process is a tool in the toolkit, but there's lots of other things that go on, and what makes sense in terms of what you're trying to do, and do it bit by bit, and understand that the goalposts will always shift, because every time you succeed, there's going to be something more that you got to do and kind of keep working on.
Thanks, Basil. So there's a question from Jason. I'm not sure if Jason wants to voice that.
I prefer when you read the questions out, Tracy.
For real?
All right, fine. Hey, Basil, thanks so much for your talk. I guess as I was listening to your talk, and also to your answer to Carol and Sophie's questions, what do you see in your scholarship as the role and the potential of civil litigation to affect transformative change? And given the state of the rules of civil procedure across Canada, do you think or write about the need for corresponding law reform in respect of civil procedure? And I just cited as one example some of the law reform around SLAPP suits, and we have Professor Young, who's with us tonight, who's an expert in that area. So just curious about that, because in many ways, when I think about, as you know, when I think about the prospects for transformative change in respect of climate action and sustainability, I think the courts are a barrier to transformative change rather than a vehicle or an agent for that. So I'm curious to hear what your view is about that.
So my perspective is it really comes down to, what are you asking a court to do and what are they good at? They're good at reviewing things ex post, after the fact. That's what they're good at. they're not very good, and they're very reticent to deal with anything ahead of time, except in very extenuating circumstances. So kind of my perspective is there are two things that kind of need to be thought about with that. First thing, what is the nature of litigation you want to bring? Are you bringing something that's accountability based? Something that is, there's something that somebody did wrong, or there's something that they should have done, that there's a clear right or something that applies that need to be done. If you're going to do that, civil litigation offers a great deal of opportunity, right? Because then you have a cause of right, you can kind of work through it, you can use the discovery process to your benefit in order to gather information and do all of that to make that work. The flip side, though, is if you're doing something that is a little bit more, not so accountability based, but a little bit more of you're trying to create something that's new or different, is litigation the best way to go ahead? And I think you have to be really strategic about it. This is the reason why I say it's the tool in the toolkit. One of the things as a litigator is we always kind of go, litigation is the answer, this is the solution, but there's the risk of getting a bad decision. So it's going to be, how can you frame it, or how can you use it and be realistic about what you can and can't do, and realistic about if you lose, how can you leverage it? So it's one of those things of sometimes you lose, and the national and housing situation is actually an example of this. They brought the right for housing stuff, Faye Faraday and a team of people who kind of talked about this. They lost, but they leveraged that into change and actually getting those discussions going in other ways. Whether that makes systemic change or systemic things over the longer term is something that's going to require a great deal of working on to entrench it over time, that people actually understand that, right? And kind of make that work. So I don't view litigation as being the only answer and the only way to do it. I think it's got to be in conjunction with a whole bunch of other stuff in order to make it work. So for example, if you did this litigation without Sam George at Ipperwash, right? Like you just did it completely, somebody in a courtroom dealing with it, I don't think it would have been as successful as Sam talking to the media, being sincere and talking about the issues and what he's trying to figure out. But then the two can play off each other. So I think it is this thing of sometimes it's that thing of in the right context, in the right situation. And one of the things that I always focus on is the idea of, I'm a big Hofeld person, right? Like that's kind of who I like. And I like the idea of, can you find a Hofeldian right where there's a duty on somebody that somebody has to do? Courts are good at understanding that. If you can't find that, then it's a lot harder to get that understanding, but it's that understanding to try to help with the framing and figure things out, and then use it as part of a bigger strategy in order to make it work. So that's the way I would kind of think about that.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I want to thank you so much, Basil, for this great presentation.